Imagine, for a second, being trapped inside a literal Iron Maiden.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And not just for a day, not for a week, but for 12 agonizing years.
That is just, I mean, it's impossible to even fathom.
Right. You are locked in complete darkness.
Yeah.
And there are these mechanized pulsating needles constantly piercing your body, and they are designed specifically to drain you of your very life force.
It's horrific.
Over a decade of this, your memories start scrambling. Like your internal timeline just fractures completely. The comforting things you once thought were real are bleeding into terrifying hallucinations. And when the day finally comes that you break free from that vault, how do you emerge as anything other than a monster?
You really don't.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a harrowing scenario to even visualize. In a situation exactly like that, you were methodically stripped of your agency, your physical autonomy, and eventually the entire architecture of your own mind.
And that total dismantling of a person is the exact premise we are using for today's deep dive. We're looking at the character Kurien from the sci-fi fantasy book Vitae, The Awakening. He is a Vitae conscript who survives this exact horrific 12-year torture at the hands of a faction called the Inquisitors. But we aren't doing a book club review today.
Right, no, we're going a lot deeper.
Exactly. We are pulling from the episode 20 research dossier, Becoming More Than the Pain, and we are using Kurien's fictional journey as this highly vivid case study to explore the real-world science of transcending trauma.
Because we are taking this extreme localized fantasy scenario to unpack some incredibly dense real-world concepts. We'll be looking at things like self-transcendence theory, the literal neurobiology of how a traumatized brain rebuilds its physical pathways, and existential philosophy.
Which sounds heavy, but it's so relevant to you, the listener, whether you realize it or not.
Oh, totally. The mechanisms of healing that Kurien is forced to discover to survive his reality, well, they mirror the exact mechanisms that humans use to survive massive disruptions in our own lives.
So let's start with Kurien's immediate reaction after escaping the Inquisitor vault. He gets out, and his immediate overwhelming instinct is that he just desperately wants to go back.
Yeah, he wants to rewind time.
Right. He has spent 12 years clinging to the memory of this woman, Covenness Myasuchi. She was the love of his life, someone he was basically bound to serve. He just wants to rewind the clock to before the Iron Maiden, before the torture, and slip right back into that old dynamic.
Which makes sense on a surface level.
It does. But the dossier firmly points out that this is a psychological impossibility. And I have to admit, that sounds a bit counterintuitive. Like, if someone goes through a terrible illness or a traumatic event, shouldn't the ultimate goal of healing be to just get back to normal?
I mean, that is the common cultural narrative, right?
Right.
But from a psychological standpoint, getting back to normal is fundamentally flawed.
Really?
Yeah. The clinical concept here is post-traumatic integration. When we talk about healing in everyday conversations, we often default to post-traumatic growth, which usually emphasizes finding a silver lining or, some positive change after a hardship.
Like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah. Exactly. But integration is a much heavier, messier process than that. Integration requires weaving the trauma into a coherent, ongoing identity. You cannot simply discard the parts of yourself that were altered or forged during that dark period.
So you're saying that clinging to who you used to be is actually holding you back?
Absolutely.
It's kind of like if you drop a heavy bead of black ink into a glass of clear water, you can't just reach in with a pair of tweezers and extract the ink to get the clear water back.
No, it doesn't work like that.
The water is fundamentally chemically changed. You have to accept that you are now a darker liquid.
Yes, that is a perfect analogy. To integrate trauma, a survivor basically has to accept that the past is permanent. They must reconcile with all the fragmented identities they inhabited during the ordeal.
Like the different versions of themselves.
Right. The victim who was helpless, the survivor who endured, and sometimes, well, the monster they had to become just to stay alive. In the source material, Kurien starts to realize that his pristine memories of peace with Myasuchi are in this wild conflict with the violent, blood-soaked reality he has lived for the last 12 years.
So they just don't match up anymore.
They don't. If he tries to force himself back into the mold of his old subservient life, he's going to experience severe cognitive dissonance.
That internal friction makes total sense. Like the brain has processed 12 years of horrific reality, but the conscious mind is essentially in denial, saying, no, none of that touched me. I am entirely the person from before.
And that denial prevents actual healing. Healing only really begins when a survivor stops trying to extract the ink. right, and starts evaluating what this new composition can actually do.
The conscious mind has to agree with the body's lived experience.
Exactly.
So if the psychological reality is that we can't go back, I have to wonder what that internal shift looks like on a physical level. Because in the book, Kurien's psychological shift is mirrored by this dramatic physical evolution.
Right, the transformation.
Yeah. He transforms from a standard Vitae, a being who slowly deteriorates and degrades from using their power, into a sanite.
A sanite being someone who can draw power directly from their environment and their own internal will without burning their own body out in the process.
So it's a shift from a destructive state to a sustainable one.
Exactly.
It's a really fascinating leap in the lore. But the Dossier connects this directly to real-world neurobiology. So how does a fantasy transformation map onto physical human brain hardware?
It maps directly onto the science of neuroplasticity.
Okay.
Our brains are not static machines. They literally physically rewire their neural pathways in response to new experiences, sustained behaviors, and core beliefs.
Wait, physically, like structurally changing?
Yes. The brain grows new connections. So Kurien's transformation into a sanite represents the brain's biological capacity to forge entirely new networks to support a new identity. The Dossier focuses on a concept called future self-construction.
Future self.
Right. In trauma recovery, healing becomes true transformation only when an individual consciously designs the person they intend to become, rather than letting their trauma automatically dictate their reactions.
Okay. I need to challenge the mechanics of that, though.
Sure.
Because if someone's amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, has been firing constantly for 12 years because of severe trauma, they are wired for hypervigilance.
They are.
So how does a severely traumatized person just consciously decide to design a future self? That sounds a bit like, I don't know, telling a drowning person to just build a boat.
It does.
How do you initiate that rewiring when you are literally still in survival mode?
It is an incredibly difficult process that requires hijacking your own neurochemistry, specifically dopamine and purpose-driven motivation.
Dopamine.
Yeah. We casually think of dopamine as the pleasure chemical, what we get from eating sugar or scrolling social media. But clinically, dopamine is the molecule of motivation and reward. When a survivor anchors themselves to a new, deeply meaningful purpose, like a vision for their future self, they begin to activate those reward circuits through small, intentional actions aligned with that purpose.
So it's not an overnight epiphany. It's a slow biological accumulation. You take a tiny action toward this new purpose, you get a microdose of dopamine, and that starts laying down a new neural pathway.
That is exactly the physical mechanism. Sustained meaning literally reshapes how your brain regulates emotion. Over time, as you reinforce these new pathways, the prefrontal cortex, which handles logic, planning, and executive function, begins to reassert top-down control over the amygdala.
Because the amygdala is where all those raw, fragmented sensory trauma memories are stored.
It is the alarm bell. And as the prefrontal cortex strengthens its connection and its regulatory power over the amygdala, those trauma memories shift.
How so?
They move from being purely reactive, where a loud noise or a specific smell makes your body feel like it is literally back in the Iron Maiden, to being reflective.
Oh, I see.
You retain the memory that the horrific event happened, but your nervous system is no longer reliving it in the present moment.
It sounds like trying to reprogram a computer's core operating system while it is actively running and executing tasks.
It is exactly like that.
The energy required to do that must be massive. The Dossier emphasizes that this future self-construction relies heavily on purpose. But is having a purpose actually a biological necessity to override the amygdala, or is it just a psychological tool to make the process feel less miserable?
No, it is an absolute biological imperative.
Really?
Yes. Without a deeply rooted purpose, the human brain operates on the principle of biological conservation. It defaults to its strongest, most well-worn pathways to save energy.
Which for a trauma survivor would be?
Fear, withdrawal, and the fight-or-flight response. The brain is trying to keep you safe by assuming the environment is always dangerous.
Right.
So to override that deeply ingrained survival mechanism, you need a vastly stronger chemical signal. Purpose provides that signal. In the narrative, Kurien's physical rewiring into a sanite is driven by his conscious, purposeful choice to reject the role he was assigned. He refuses to be the tortured conscript or the broken weapon of his captors. He designs a future self defined by his own agency, not their cruelty.
He refuses to just be a vessel for the pain they inflicted on him. But, I mean, to survive that vault and execute his escape, he didn't just sit and meditate on a positive future.
No, he didn't.
He had to tap into some incredibly violent instincts. The book refers to this as his demon aspect.
Yeah.
And this takes us from the biological hardware into the philosophical software running in the brain.
And this is where the integration process becomes highly volatile.
Hmm.
What do you do when the very traits that ensured your survival are traits you are morally repulsed by?
Right, because in the vault, there's a moment where Kurien looks at his reflection. He sees this cold, soulless malice staring back at him. He realizes his soul is mirroring the horrific, disfiguring damage done to his physical body. But the crucial turning point is that he realizes he needs that cold indifference. He needs that monstrous strength and aggression to physically break out of his captivity.
Yes.
And the Dossier views this through the lens of existential becoming and Nietzsche's concept of the self as creation.
So existential becoming is the philosophical stance that identity is not a static essence you just discover hidden deep inside yourself.
Like you don't just find yourself on a retreat.
Exactly. It is something you actively, continuously create through your choices and actions. And Nietzsche argued that the highest act of human will is to shape oneself, and that this identity is almost always forged through intense struggle and suffering.
So how does that apply to the demon aspect?
Kurien is forced to accept his shadow. The repressed rage, the capacity for extreme violence, the immorality required to survive the Iron Maiden. He has to recognize that the demon aspect isn't an external curse placed upon him. It is his own trauma made flesh.
Okay, tapping into cold malice to survive makes total sense in a fantasy torture vault. But looking at this through a real-world lens, telling someone to embrace their repressed rage or their capacity for violence sounds incredibly dangerous.
It can be.
Aren't we just giving people a philosophical free pass to become abusers themselves? Like, where is the line between integrating your shadow and just succumbing to it and becoming a monster? Because in the book, there are maddened husks who completely give in to this Vitae madness, and they just destroy everything around them.
It is profoundly dangerous, which is why trauma recovery without guidance can sometimes lead to cycles of abuse. The safeguard against becoming the monster lies in humanistic philosophy, specifically the concept of the actualized self.
The actualized self.
Right. Humanistic philosophy posits that humans reach their fullest potential only when they transcend base fears and impose limitations to become authentically self-authored. Real-world survivors of incredibly hostile environments, like combat veterans or individuals who grew up in severely abusive households, they often develop fierce, aggressive protector instincts.
Because they had to be combative to survive.
Exactly.
But the difference is what they do with that combativeness once they are out of the hostile environment.
The defining line between integrating the shadow and becoming a husk is intent and moral agency.
Okay.
You integrate the strength and the situational awareness of the shadow, but you revoke its permission to dictate your moral compass. You recognize your capacity for ferocity, and you consciously harness it to protect rather than to exploit. You fully own your capacity for violence or anger so that you have the agency to consciously choose peace.
So if you don't own it, it owns you.
Exactly.
If your shadow is your deep-seated anger and you just repress it because society says anger is bad, it will leak out as passive aggression or sudden destructive outbursts.
Right. It always finds a way out.
But if you integrate it, you realize that anger is just an indicator that your boundaries are being crossed. You use that fiery energy to firmly say no and protect your peace.
That is integration in action.
Yeah.
Repression strengthens the shadow's disorganized influence over you. Acceptance brings it under the jurisdiction of the prefrontal cortex we discussed earlier.
Ah, circling back to the brain hardware.
Yep. Kurien has to accept his capacity to be a monster so that he can regulate it.
Regulating the shadow is vital, but according to the Dossier, it is only the bridge. The ultimate destination of this entire harrowing journey is what psychological researchers call self-transcendence theory.
Right. And self-transcendence occurs when the suffering you endured shifts from being a pointless tragedy to becoming the actual fuel for your ongoing transformation.
So it's not just about you anymore.
Exactly. At this stage, your identity expands completely beyond the boundaries of the original trauma. You are no longer just reacting to what happened to you. You are utilizing your integrated self to connect with and elevate others.
And this plays out in what I think is one of the most powerful scenes in the source material.
Oh, absolutely.
So, Kurien has escaped the vault. He has found Sharina, another survivor who has endured her own horrific history of captivity and violation trauma.
Right.
And because of what she's been through, she is starting to regress. Her own trauma and her own unintegrated demon aspect are threatening to consume her with madness. In a state of pure panic, she attacks him. She literally digs her fangs into his chest.
It is a textbook, severe trauma response. She is terrified of her own monstrous potential, overwhelmed by her environment, and she is lashing out at the closest person, reverting to pure survival mechanics.
And what does Kurien do in response? Keep in mind, this is the guy who just a few chapters ago was a swirling vortex of malice, destroying an Inquisitor vault and consuming the life force of his captors.
He could easily destroy her.
But instead of fighting back, he pulls Sharina down to his bleeding chest. He holds her securely while she violently struggles. He hums a foreign lullaby to her.
It's such a striking image.
It really is. And he willingly allows her to feed on his Vitae, his own blood and life force, to calm her frenzy and stabilize her. He takes this incredibly dangerous, monstrous Sanite power that he possesses, and he subverts it to create a moment of pure, ethical connection.
That scene is the absolute embodiment of self-transcendence. He takes the very essence that was forcibly drained from him in the Iron Maiden, his life force, his vulnerability, and he freely offers it to heal someone else.
Wow.
In that moment, he is no longer the helpless victim of the Inquisitors, nor is he the violent, reactive monster who escaped them. He has transcended both of those inherited roles to become a stabilizing guide and a protector, entirely on his own terms.
There is a quote from the Dossier analyzing this moment that perfectly distills the entire journey. Kurien realizes, my pain shaped me, but it does not define who I will become.
Yes.
Taking this out of the sci-fi setting, how do we see this specific type of self-transcendence manifest in our everyday reality?
Well, the most profound real-world parallel the Dossier highlights is the phenomenon of individuals who break generational cycles of violence or addiction.
Cycle breakers.
Exactly. Consider someone raised in a highly abusive, chaotic environment. They could easily let that trauma dictate their future, adopting the toxic behaviors modeled for them because, as we discussed, it is the brain's default pathway.
It's the path of least resistance.
It is. But instead, they do the exhausting work of future self-construction. They take the intense hypervigilance and the survival skills they learned in the dark, and they actively repurpose them to build radically empathetic, fiercely safe homes for their own children.
They use the skills they learned as victims, but as protectors instead.
Exactly. They refuse to pass the pain forward. They create entirely new generational narratives, proving that while trauma alters you, your ultimate identity is the highest act of will. They don't just recover to a baseline. They transcend the cycle entirely.
To take the worst thing that ever happened to you and turn it into a shield for someone else.
That's the essence of it.
Let's synthesize all of this for you listening right now. What the science of psychology, neurobiology, and philosophy are all pointing toward is that healing from profound hardship isn't a time machine. You do not get to step into a capsule and arrive back at an unbroken, untouched past.
No, you really don't.
It is not about pretending the ink was never dropped into the water. Healing is the demanding, messy work of integrating your shadow. It is about actively giving your prefrontal cortex the purpose it needs to physically rewire your brain.
Right.
It is the conscious, daily construction of a future self that is vastly larger than the things that hurt you.
And the most empowering takeaway from this research is that the science of self-transcendence applies universally. You don't need to be escaping a fantasy torture vault for this to be relevant.
Thankfully.
Yeah. Whether you are navigating a massive life shift, facing everyday hardships, or doing the grueling work of overcoming profound real-world trauma, the biological and philosophical mechanics of identity creation are exactly the same. You possess the biological hardware and the philosophical capacity to author your next chapter.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to carry with you today. If identity is not a hidden treasure you simply discover, but rather a masterpiece you actively create, who are you deliberately choosing to become with the ink that has already been dropped into your water? What specific part of your own shadow, that deep-seated anger, that stubbornness, that cold survival instinct you've been ashamed of, could actually become your greatest protective tool if you stopped fighting it and started integrating it?